First of all, I am so incredibly, just so sorry to hear about what's happened in the Philippines with the dam. That is just horrific. I hope your friends and loved ones are okay. What a phenomenally traumatic experience and time for you guys on the back of such an intense year, honestly. When will it stop? It's quite something, isn't it? So I've actually just got in from a long drive. I went down to a lake, Taupo, where a friend of mine lives, for her 40th birthday, and me and her and another friend of ours, actually her two bridesmaids, we climbed a mountain called the Tongariro on Friday. It was a really cool experience. It's something I've always wanted to do. But I'm a little bit sunburnt and definitely a little travel weary, as I had my son with me in the car. And I've been trying not to do devices when we travel, so no screens when we travel. Oh, it was so hard. We had to stop and buy a couple of different Legos, and I was like, what am I doing? What are you even doing, Claire? I've tried to have no screens with him for a month now, just to see what he's like, because he was getting a bit sort of fiendish with the screen. And the change in him has been really interesting, but I don't know how sustainable no screens is in this day and age. Okay, so my name's Claire. Lovely to have you here. This is just an informal chat about the meditation course that I teach. So I live down here in New Zealand, and I teach people how to meditate. I teach people how to develop a self-sufficient daily practice, because I love talking about meditation. I love teaching people about meditation. I love studying it. I love practicing it. I've had my own practice now for about 8 years, specifically of a seated meditative practice. Before that, I was a yoga teacher, and yoga was my gateway into a seated meditative practice. I got into yoga almost accidentally about 15 years ago, when I got a really serious knee injury. So in this session today, I'll just tell you a little bit about myself and my practices, and then how I teach, and what you can expect if you're thinking about doing the course with us. I got into yoga I didn't even really get into it in any kind of deep sense. I just started practicing yoga after I got a really serious knee injury at a wedding one day when I was about 24, 25. I fell over. I was exceptionally drunk and severed my patella tendon. I used to drink a lot all through my 20s. And that got me into Bikram Yoga. And for those of you who have done a little bit of yoga, you might know that Bikram's the hot yoga, very physical practice, no philosophy, no spirituality even. They don't talk about anything spiritual in Bikram classes. It's almost like the military style yoga. You just get barked at for an hour and a half. But for some reason I liked that. So I started doing Bikram, and then a couple of years later I moved to Los Angeles. And in Los Angeles I went through a really, really difficult time, mentally, emotionally, a very confusing time. 10 years ago, we didn't talk, especially not down here in New Zealand. So New Zealand is very much a just get on with it, harden up, toughen up type of culture. It's only really started shifting in the last few years, and we have terrible statistics down here in New Zealand with men's mental health, particularly, because the culture for men is that real men don't talk about their feelings. Real men don't ask for help. For women, it's a little bit different, but not too much better. We're almost I kind of describe it as quite a self-conscious culture, and showing our true feelings doesn't come naturally to us. It's a or it's generationally kind of passed down from our English ancestors, I think. So yeah, we have terrible problems with the suicide rate here in New Zealand, one of the worst in the world. And for me, when I got to 29, 30, things had gotten quite bad for me in terms of depression and anxiety. And I used to cope with those internal states predominantly through, well, a wide-ranging set of coping mechanisms. Alcohol was definitely a leading one, and drugs, and overachievement, and perfectionism, and trying to control everything around me. I got to a place where things felt incredibly, incredibly hard, and some of the worst things a human being can contemplate kind of came into my head for the first time, and I knew I had to do something about it. So I made some pretty substantial life changes, and I lived in Los Angeles at the time. And a friend of mine was doing a yoga teacher training, and I decided to do that teacher training with her, mainly to keep myself out of mischief. But it was successful. It was highly successful. That 6-month experience changed the course of my life completely. And I started to understand through the practice of yoga. So we have the physical practice of yoga, but we also have the yogic philosophy, the science, the disciplines, the 8 limbs of yoga, the namas and the niyamas, so the codes of conduct, what we do and don't do, and concepts like ahimsa, so not to harm, not to harm the people around us, but not to harm ourselves with what we're doing to ourselves and what we're thinking, started to permeate my life. And I started to really be confronted with how the internal environment, what was happening inside me, so my feelings and my thoughts, how much they were coloring my life experience and creating my life experience. And I had never, ever contemplated anything like this. I grew up in a very anti, even going to a psychologist to my parents is nonsense. So I really, for the first time in my life, started to learn about the human nature, because what I was experiencing, the confusion, the unhappiness, the discontent, it's actually a normal part of a human existence. Like, we all experience highs and lows. We have things happen that trigger an emotional response. And if we didn't have these emotions, we wouldn't be human. But unfortunately, we're not taught, most of us haven't been taught how to be with our emotions, how to express them. And we tend to live lives avoiding feeling certain feelings. And so yoga was the gateway into me starting to address some of the things that were happening inside, and also to notice the thought patterns, the thoughts I used to think about myself. For the first time in my life, all of a sudden I was like, wow, there's this background noise, and it's not a particularly nice place to live a lot of the time. And so yoga was the first sort of gateway in. I lived in an area in Los Angeles where there were so many opportunities to learn. And I actually was going through a divorce at this time early on. And I didn't have children, so I could immerse myself in learning. And I learned with some of the most incredible teachers on the planet, which I feel very blessed to have done. And I continue to learn with some pretty amazing teachers, because once you open the Pandora's box of this kind of evolution and learning, well, for some people, you just thirst for more. And the more you practice, and the more you start to unravel yourself, and more questions kind of come into your life experience, shaking the foundations of the things that you really believed about yourself. All of a sudden, when you start to question things, it opens up a whole new world of, excuse me, possibilities. So back then I started learning with different teachers, and I started learning about how different a self-sufficient seated meditative practice was different to yoga. And I started going to a Buddhist community, which was a very confusing time, because a lot of the Buddhist teaching is it's like they're speaking a whole different language, and unless you've been meditating for a while, you don't really have a frame of reference or anything to apply it to. But I used to sit there and listen, and all I knew was most of the people I really admired in the world had some kind of meditative practice. Didn't really understand what meditation was, though. My first taste, as it is for a lot of people, was Shavasana. So you lay down at the end of your yoga class. And yoga is a meditative practice, and that we become more present in our physical body. But in terms of a still meditative practice, Shavasana, when we lay down at the end of the class, when what we've just done integrates into our body, was my first sort of taste of that stillness. And I'd go to these courses, and it would be very confusing. And it wasn't for a number of years. It wasn't, a couple of years down the track that things started to click a little bit for me. Most of the time with meditation, I'd sit there and wonder if I was doing it properly, which I now know means you are doing it properly, because you're becoming aware. You're becoming aware of what's happening in your mind and what's happening in your body, and you're questioning, hang on, what's going on here? Are these thoughts meditative thoughts? Is this the meditative process? That's the journey. That's the evolution of this. There's all these questions. The ego and the mind loves to question and compare. It loves to figure out if we're doing things right or not. And so those questions are the first glimpse of ego, wanting to control the situation. Back then, I didn't know that was the case. But our progression with meditation as humans tends to be pretty similar. Because the process is that of fundamentally of unlearning. So when I teach people to meditate, I have a foundation within the teaching. One of the foundations is awareness. The next foundation is the unraveling, the unlearning that occurs. So as we sit with ourselves, we start to unravel and deprogram our ego, and the programming that started when we were little babies. As soon as we pop out into the world, we start to be conditioned so that we fit into society's expectations, the people who raised us, expectations. It's a natural, innate human need to belong so that we can survive fundamentally. So we start to modify our behavior so that we become appropriate, for want of a better word, for the particular environment that we're growing up in. So culturally, what's wrong, right, good, bad will be slightly different or very different from country to country, and even within families. What's an appropriate emotional response? What's an appropriate emotion to show? Behavior that we any behaviors that we have, there are different these little subtle or not so subtle differences from family to family, society to society, country to country, etc., etc. So this shapes us, and a lot of that conditioning has kept us safe. Kept us safe for a long time. That conditioning becomes coping mechanisms as well. So the perfectionism that I talked about earlier, perfectionism is a coping mechanism. Procrastination can be a coping mechanism. Drinking alcohol can be a coping mechanism. Moving away from confrontation can be a coping mechanism. What we eat, what we consume, can all be different types of coping mechanism. And sometimes they're fine and they don't cause us any harm. But a lot of the time, these little pathways that we find ourselves in, or aspects of our personality that we really believe is us, are limiting us more than we more than we know fundamentally. because it's always been that way for us. And when we meditate, we start to unravel that. And some of the coping mechanisms shift and change, and different ways of doing things start to become an easier choice rather than something we have to force ourselves to do. So when we meditate, that happens as well. And then finally, as we're sitting in meditation, one of the most profound things that you experience is a very deep level of unstressing. So unstressing the nervous system. And this year has been phenomenally stressful for the whole entire world. Like even within, I'm down here in New Zealand, where by the grace of God, we have escaped this pandemic relatively unscathed, in the sense that not too many people died of COVID or even got COVID here in this country, because we have a small country, we have a tiny population, so it's easy to put the restrictions into place here in New Zealand. But people's jobs have been affected, people's families around the world have been affected, the whole world around us has been affected, and no human exists in a vacuum. And we've also had elections. Our economy's been incredibly affected, but you know, our cousins across the ditch in Australia have been profoundly affected. What's happening within your country, the rest of the world, it all feeds into the collective psyche. And so we're experiencing much higher levels of stress and fight or flight, and that activated response to the world. And I'm sure you're all hyper aware of what I'm talking about. But what we cannot be aware of is how we cope with the stress. What happens when we do feel nervous, scared, and that's on a spectrum. Yeah, it's all on a spectrum. So really palpable, tangible fear is one end, and then apprehension, anxiety is another end of that spectrum. What do we do when we feel those feelings? And it can be really counterintuitive when we're feeling stressed and activated to take care of ourselves. It can feel really difficult when we're feeling these feelings to sit in stillness and have some, for what should we call it, downtime? Because when you're activated and when you're in your fight or flight, you just want to go, you just want to do stuff, you just want to move. It's what anxiety does. It fuels action, because we feel like if we don't act, something terrible might happen. When we meditate, we start to shift that response in a really phenomenal way. And if we practice a couple of times a day, so I teach a practice where we meditate twice a day, hopefully, for 20 minutes. And in that 20-minute window of time that you gift yourself, you experience a similar level of rest to deep sleep. And we need rest. When our nervous system's activated, when we're in fight or flight, we need rest. Rest is when we heal. Rest is when all the systems of the body start to do what they're supposed to do to take care of us. That's why when people start to experience extended, prolonged periods of stress, they start to age faster, because the system is having to compensate because of what's happening in the body. So stress is incredibly aging. It affects every system in our bodies. It actually is the foundational cause of most diseases, either directly or indirectly. And indirectly, what I mean by indirectly is, for example, if you are, for a lot of people, if you have a really stressful day, how do people unwind when they get home? Here in New Zealand, people come home, they have a glass of wine. And over time, alcohol can cause all sorts of issues within the physical body, and the mental body and the emotional body. But that's kind of an indirect way stress affects us, because it can mean we do things to alleviate the symptoms of stress, which, if you really get into it, Stress is a feeling in your nervous system, that adrenaline, that cortisol, and it doesn't feel good a lot of the time. So what do? Try and get rid of it. Try and stop the feeling. So we'll have a drink. There are lots of other ways that people try and get rid of that stress sensation. Some healthy ways are meditation. Exercise is a wonderful way. Getting out in nature is an incredible way to start to regulate the nervous system. Yoga, all these different things. But most of the time when we are in an activated state, we kind of don't want to do those things. We drink too much coffee. We have too much wine. We create more in our to-do list. The stress response is phenomenally tricky because it tells us that we need to do more. Because if we don't, something terrible is going to happen. So 3 pillars of meditation: awareness. So that awareness, and the aware part of you is the part that's listening to me now. Yeah, there's a way you can focus in on me. And then if I said left big toe, you might become aware of your left big toe. Then if I said tummy button, your awareness moves there. And if I said thoughts, what's going on in your mind? You might notice that when you try and become aware or think of the thoughts, they kind of disappear. Yeah, that awareness short circuits them. And then feelings. So in this conversation, as I'm talking to you, how are you feeling in your physical body? And depending on what's happened for you today and within your country, it's been a phenomenally intense day, I imagine. A lot of activation for some of you. How does that feel? Can you feel the stress, the adrenaline, the fight or flight in your physical body? So can you just become aware of the sensation? And that's the beginning of everything, that awareness. And the awareness is the tool that we use in this practice, and we get better at becoming aware. And with that awareness, there's a patience that also comes, and there's a compassion that also comes, because that awareness is inherently compassionate and kind and patient. And then the unraveling that happens is because with that awareness and that gentleness and that compassion, these feelings that may have been a bit trapped or ignored or stuck or repressed, we start to feel them and they flow and they unravel and they no longer rule our lives. And then when that happens, when we're no longer resisting the sensations and the feelings in our body, then the body unstresses. And the whole process is very gentle. I like to think of my meditation as how twice a day I get to check in. I check in with myself, see how I'm going. It's like a little, how you doing? How you doing right now? And when we do that twice a day, then it becomes much harder to stray from the path too far. Because twice a day we come back and we check in, and then we can take steps according to how we're feeling that day. For example, I've had a really intense 3 days, like hilarious 3 days of climbing a mountain. I had to sleep in a spare room with 2 6-year-olds on the floor. I had 3 interesting nights sleep, kept being woken up. My son lost a tooth, so the tooth fairy had to come one night, and he kept waking me up and telling me to stop fidgeting because the tooth fairy wouldn't come. So that was a fantastic night's sleep. And then we had a big 40th birthday party with like 100 people, another bad night's sleep, and then another long drive. So in my physical body right now, I'm feeling tired, really tired. But I'm very aware of that. So I'm aware that I feel tired. And so this afternoon, this evening, I will take steps accordingly. And I'll take care of myself because I'm aware that I'm tired and I know that I need to have a lot of water, a nice meal, and an early night. And when you meditate as well, you don't get scared of tiredness, because you know that you practice twice a day. And in those practices, you get almost the equivalent of 3 hours deep rest. Okay, so when I teach people how to meditate, I teach them the fundamentals. We talk about some of the benefits. We talk about how to practice, when to practice, what meditation is, because there's a lot of misinformation out there about meditation. And that misinformation makes it much harder for people to learn, because they think they're not doing it right. But there are... it's very, very difficult to meditate wrongly. Very difficult. But most importantly, I feel once I've taught you, then you become part of our meditation community. We have an online group that meets once a week, almost once a week. Sometimes I have to miss the groups if I have something on, but we do it through Facebook. So I will guide everyone through a meditation, and then some of the people who are here in Auckland with me will come in person, and we might have a chat, or you can type little questions in the Facebook chat. And then also, I'm always here for my students. So I get emails from my students every single day asking me questions about their practice, because things happen and there are questions, and you might unravel some stuff that is confusing or confronting, and you just need someone to talk to about it. And it's not human nature to ask for help and step into the discomfort of maybe not knowing something. But that's why I think I have continued with this practice and been successful in this practice, because I have had people that I've asked a lot of questions to. I have been super annoying to my teachers, and I still work with teachers. So I have a mentor here in New Zealand, and I have a Swami in India that I see once a week at the moment. And that's not just for my practice, but so that I can be the most effective teacher that I can be within meditation. So I'd love to have you join us on the course. If you have any questions, you are more than welcome to either put them in the chat or unmute yourself and ask me a question, or send me an email, or contact me through Instagram. I'm on Instagram at Claire Robbie, and ask me any questions. Even if you have a meditative practice already and you want to ask me something, then of course you are more than welcome to do so. Okay. Now, why is my laptop not charging? Hang on a second. I'm about to run out of power. What is going on? Excuse me 1 second. There we go. My son always says, Mummy, that was not 1 second. That was 5, or that was 10, or that was 15. He holds me accountable. Any questions out there? No? No? Okay. Well, lovely to have you all here and have a little chat, and to see some familiar faces. JP, Christina. Feel free to get in touch with anything, and I will hopefully see you all again soon. Okay. Namaste.
Thanks, Claire.